Namaskar. On behalf of India Science and the Department of Science and Technology, I, Nidhi Kumar, extend a very warm welcome to you on this program today. विज्ञान एवं प्रौद्योगिकी विभाग की ओर से आप सभी का स्वागत और अभिनंदन. Tam Soma Jyotirgame. Let us begin today's auspicious event with the praise of the most merciful and the most benevolent Lord. जैसा कि हम सभी जानते हैं, किसी भी कार्यक्रम का शुभ आरंभ दीप प्रज्वलन से किया जाता है. I request our esteemed dignitaries.
कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शत्रुबुद्धिविनाशाय दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः.
After that absolutely enthralling lamplighting ceremony, a little bit about DST. Remembering 50 years of the Department of Science and Technology and what has been the numerous challenges, the journey, the enormous success, and to talk about that and more, we have with us two very eminent speakers today. Professor Ashutosh Sharma, Secretary, Department of Science and Technology. Namaste, sir. And Krishnamurthy Subramanian, currently Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Namaste. Our topic for today is on the other side of the pandemic. A fresh wave of coronavirus infections in Europe is also seeing a fresh wave of lockdowns. Likewise, in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, these are aimed at averting a winter tragedy. India's infection trajectory is looking comparatively comfortable, friends, with October seeing a fall in daily COVID-19 numbers and with most of the recent good news of the active cases dropping. But we cannot be squandered by the carelessness called pandemic fatigue, as preventing another infection spike is doable. It is my privilege to welcome my esteemed panelists. I would first like to welcome Professor Ashutosh Sharma, Secretary, Department of Science and Technology. He has been the founder of the Center for Nanoscience and Center for Advanced Imaging and chairman of Chemical Engineering and Center for Environmental Sciences, all at IIT Kanpur. He's a recipient of many scientific awards and honors, including the Infosys Prize in Engineering and Computer Science, the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize, Distinguished Alumni Award of IIT-K, and Sunny Buffalo and honoris causa from several universities in India and abroad. He has helped initiate several new programs related to infrastructure and human capacity building, innovation and startups, R&D in advanced manufacturing, waste processing, clean energy, and cyber physical systems, industry academia cooperation, science communication, women scientists, and major international collaborations in the area of priority for the nation. We welcome you, sir. It is now my pleasure to welcome amidst us as our keynote speaker today, Krishnamurthy Venkata Subramanian, an Indian economist and the current Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Shri Subramanian has also been a professor at the Indian School of Business. He holds a Master's of Business Administration and a Doctor of Philosophy in Financial Economics from the Booth School of Business, University of Chicago. He is also an alumni of the IIT Kanpur, where he studied electrical engineering, as well as the Indian Institute of Management, Kolkata, where he was awarded an Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation Dissertation Fellowship in 2005. Thank you for joining us today, sir. I now welcome Ashutosh sir to share his vision and the milestones achieved in DST so far. Sir.
Yeah, thank you, Nidhi. So indeed, it's been a journey of 50 years for DST. 50 years is not a long time, but during this time, the 5 decades, it's been working to make capacity and capability in all areas of science and technology and innovation So DST has been supporting everything from atoms to astrophysics, as well as have a very wide stakeholder base, all the way from school students to very, very senior scientists. I would like to share with you very quickly the new directions that Department of Science and Technology has been growing in. We have been very fortunate that in the last 5 years, our budget has more than doubled. And so what that means is it's possible to explore new directions. It is possible to add on things which are of great priority for the nation. Uh, so if we look at these four or five different directions very, very quickly, so one is, of course, to shore up our basic research, in particular the quality and profoundness of that research, because we know that India is already number three in the world in terms of number of scientific publications and is growing very rapidly. So what we need to focus on now is really disruptive research, quality research, profound research, basically moving away from the incremental research. The second direction, which is very important for applied sciences, is to have a very clear direction and relevance, which is set up right in the beginning of a project or a mission or a program. So that's very important, and bringing in industry to work in these applied science areas, in the areas of technology, and to connect our projects with national priorities and missions, for example, Make in India, and so on. Um, Another aspect, we know that innovation and startups have gained a lot of traction and a lot of momentum in the last 6 years. And indeed, we have doubled the ecosystem for innovation. DST working in that area has made more incubators and supported more startups in the last 5 years than in the previous 50 years put together. So this basically means that there is a huge emphasis on creating new opportunities for our scientists, for our young people, taking into account our demographic dividend, and creating new jobs, creating new wealth. Just to talk about wealth and jobs, third-party evaluation of incubators and startups that have been there in the last 3 years shows that it created new wealth of about 27,000 crores, and it created 80,000 new jobs. So there's just a very limited context, looking at the fact that DST spent maybe a little over 1,000 crores in supporting these startups. So the yields are really, really tremendous. And we need to do more of that. Other directions are related to diversity, inclusion, and equity. What that means is that people of all ages, gender, socioeconomic background, as well as the geographic location ought to all be able to contribute very strongly to the growth of science, technology, and innovation in the country. Of course, one has to be ready for the future, which is coming at us at faster and faster rate. So there are disruptive technologies out there on the horizon. We all know about artificial intelligence, machine learning, Industry 4.0, robotics, quantum technologies, electric mobility, supercomputing, and so on. So there have been new large-scale missions in all of these areas that create human resources, that create training, skills, infrastructure, capacity, new startups, new connects with the industry in all of these areas. And finally, let me conclude by saying that Department of Science and Technology has also been doing a great job of making new policies in the areas of science, technology, and innovation. Four of those policies are now in their last stages. There is an overarching policy on science, technology, innovation 2020, which would be coming in later this year. In addition, there are policies related to scientific social responsibility, a very interesting, a very compelling concept that perhaps we would talk a little bit later more in detail, as well as a policy for scientific infrastructure, and finally, policy for geospatial data. 50 years has been glorious 50 years. DST has contributed to almost anything in science and technology that happens in the nation. with very wide stakeholder base. And these are the foundational 50 years based on which we can build a great building of science and technology in the next 50 years. Thank you, Nidhi.
Uh, Thank you, sir. And indeed, we need to connect the dots. More power to DST, more power to you, sir. We need to redraw, reimagine, reinvent India, and science and technology plays a major part there. I now request you, sir, our keynote speaker for today, Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Indian economist and currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the GOI, to please share your keynote lectures.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. I think innovation is very, very important to any country. Innovation has been shown to have a very, very important component of economic growth. Not only economic growth itself, but also equitable economic growth. What is important to keep in mind here is the long run nature of innovation and science and technology. When we look forward for the next 50 years, I think this is extremely important. To illustrate this point, let me give you a very simple illustration. Many of us would have watched the movie The Man Who Saw Infinity on the mathematician Ramanujan. Now, one of the key things that is important to keep in mind is when Ramanujan was doing his research on number theory, if, let's say, Thomas Hardy had asked the question saying, what is the relevance of this research? How is it going to get applicable in the next 10, 20 years? And possibly, use that criterion to say that, this research and number theory will get funded only if it is relevant in the next 10, 20 years, then, it is easy to imagine that the research would not have happened. And so some of the search engines today that actually use the algorithms and many of the other applications of number theory would not have materialized at all. So something that was done just as part of research for the sake of research itself, in order to understand, just, to develop curiosity, to further the knowledge frontier, has become so important about 100 years later. I think this illustrates the importance of doing research just for the sake of it. It does find applicability, but it finds applicability over a much longer horizon. So it is necessary, therefore, for corporates, for policymakers, especially in science and technology, and our academic institutions, to focus and understand that research, and especially basic research, is something that has a very long horizon. So basic research needs to be supported just for its own sake. I think there can't be a better example than what I've talked about in the case of C. Ramanujan. The second related aspect then is about taking that research, and applying it in the context of in the context of the country's problems. Here again, it is really important for the Indian Indian ecosystem in research and development to be competing with the best. It's really critical that we actually think about how we are faring with the best. I think we've done very well in the last 50 years, but I think going forward we have to actually be keeping our ambitions really very, very high. I'll give you a parallel here. Think about the 1990s cricket team, and contrast it to the cricket teams that Saurav Ganguly and Mahendra Singh Dhoni led. The 1990s cricket team was one that actually used to win a lot on the Indian pitches, had a lot to write about in the Indian context. But was it a team that really went ahead and won accolades all over the world? In contrast, the teams led by Saurav Ganguly and Dhoni actually did that. That has to be the benchmark for us in the next 50 years, that we actually are counted among the best in the world. Our universities are among the top 10, top 20 in terms of actual number of publications, in the top journals in the world. In terms of our patents, our intellectual property, we have to be among the best. That is the ambition that we must have, actually, because if innovation has to help solve the various problems in our country, then this kind of ambition is extremely important. Which brings me then to the third key aspect, something that all our policymakers, especially corporates, need to really think about, which is that innovation, research and development does not happen in an environment where failure is not tolerated. When innovation is path breaking, and having worked in this area, on what is called in economics as endogenous growth, which comes from innovation, the literature makes this distinction between exploitative innovation and explorative innovation, something that Professor Sharma also mentioned about, which is that exploitative innovation is marginal, while explorative innovation is path breaking. And what is really critical here is for us to really push on the explorative innovation front, and that does not happen without actually enormous tolerance for failure, because the more path breaking the innovation, inevitably there will be failures. And it is therefore important for us to create that ecosystem where we have that long run vision, and thereby also tolerate failure, because failure is what then becomes actually the stepping stone for success, especially in the context of path-breaking innovation. So our firms actually have to have that long-run vision. This is for the corporate boards and the CEOs to actually take into account that, by being myopic or thinking about, the next quarter's earnings being quarter tak, for instance, they cannot really create the really innovative companies. They have to have that long run vision and be tolerant of failure. I think these are key dimensions that we have to focus on. Finally, I think the importance of universities. If you take the two key innovation ecosystems in the world, Silicon Valley and Route 128. Silicon Valley has the Stanfords, the Berkeleys, really furthering innovation. Similarly, Route 128, has the Harvards, the MITs, and the others actually, contributing basic research and development that leads to innovation. Therefore, we also have to have that aspiration that our IITs, our IISc, our Delhi School of Economics has to rank in the top 10 in innovation, in its intellectual property. That's the kind of ambition that we need to be pursuing, thereby actually not be satisfied being the 1990s cricket team, but being the team that actually gets acknowledged all over the world. I think this is what the mission has to be for the next 50 years, so that India can really go and occupy its deserved place in the Committee of Nations.
So, thank you so much. I think absolutely brilliant what you said. I do tend to agree with every word that you said, and also how the government plans to jumpstart the economic activity by giving these kind of examples. But sir, here I'd like to make a point, and this is coming strictly from me. I just Googled and I saw that India is spending on scientific research 0.6 to 0.7% of our GDP. I think it is here we need your assistance, sir, to have that kind of, larger picture and not the myopic one. And I love the example you gave about Thomas Hardy also. Very, very path-breaking lecture indeed. Professor Ashutosh, sir, I'd like to request you now to allow me to take a few questions that are flashing on our screens. Sir.
Go ahead.
Sir. So question number 1, sir, is for you, Subramanian, sir. We need to grow at 8%. This is the Prime Minister's vision. We need to focus on a strategic blueprint of the Prime Minister's vision for a 5 trillion economy, gathering evidence from China and other East Asian economies. How can we look at pursuing investment-driven growth? This is from Ravish from IIM Bangalore. Sir.
Ravish, it's an excellent question. In fact, something that we had pondered over when we wrote the economic survey in July 2019. So I would kindly request you to go and read the first chapter of the economic survey of July 2019, which was, laying out that blueprint, strategic blueprint for India to achieve the necessary growth that is required for it to become the third largest economy in the world, and the in its pursuit of the $5 trillion goal. And by looking at not only China and the East Asian economies, but what we did was, after the Second World War, we looked at every country that grew at least for 2 decades at 5% plus. So that's the filter that we used. Every country that grew at least 5% for consistently for 2 decades, not just ephemeral periods of growth, but consistent growth of 5% plus. And we then went and looked at what was the driver of that of that kind of growth. Now the reason this is important is because at the macroeconomic level, every variable is both a cause and an effect, and therefore it requires actually scholarly work to disentangle what is the key driver, because if you think about investment needs savings then requires economic growth. Economic growth itself comes from investment, so they're all actually tangled with each other, very much like the way billiard balls move in a table. One actually hits the other and then creates a cascading effect. So what we discovered there was that if you look at these countries that have grown at such high growth rates over a consistent long period of time, consistently over a long period of time, what stands out was it was investment driven growth. It starts with investment. Investment then actually increases productivity. Investment also creates jobs, and high paying jobs, which then puts money in the hands of people. That enhances demand. The combination of the improvement in productivity and increase in employment then really enables demand, which then affects consumption. Seeing more consumption, then companies invest even more. That's how that virtuous loop proceeds, and this is what we really need to be focusing on. In fact, if you look at the slowdown itself that has happened since 2017, it is because this virtuous loop has not proceeded as fast. Investment declined. As a result of the investment decline, growth declined. Because the growth declined, consumption got impacted. Because consumption got impacted, then firms basically did not anticipate as much consumption and therefore reduce their investment. So what we really need to do is to actually now reverse that trend, and that is what the series of reforms that have been launched now by this government can really accelerate this process by enhancing the productive capacity. And these reforms are especially focused on two sectors, the primary and the secondary sectors of the economy. Primary is agriculture, secondary is manufacturing, which has the potential to create enormous number of good well-paying jobs, and thereby accelerate this process. So we've already laid out the agenda. I would request you to go and take a careful look at that, and it is actually investment driven.
Thank you, sir. I hope, Ravish, you got your answer. And as you said, during the festival time, in any case, we're seeing acceleration in consumer buying. So the next question for you, Ashutosh sir. There is a report that the COVID surge in India is now on the downslide, sir, leaving Delhi and 2-3 other places. So this question comes from Radhika from Delhi. She says, how early can India control COVID-19? And what are the protocols that you wish to elaborate upon now?
Yeah, of course, this is an important question, not just for Radhika, but for all of us. And so before I come to that question, let me just say that I was so glad to hear the views of Krishnamurthy Subramanian, his opening remarks. And I have to say that here a scientist and an economist are totally on the same page, which is rather rare, because economists say, hey, give the little money to science. So money comes from somewhere and then it gets consumed by science. And so both of them have to work together. It's like a pipeline, right? Where money comes in and it gets converted into knowledge. And I very much like the fact that he was saying that, look, we have to push for the profound knowledge. Our ambition has to be high, and it can indeed be high. There's no reason, absolutely no reason at all as to why our top institutions and scientists cannot perform at 10x level. So we talk about Atmanirbharta, Atmanirbhar Bharat, and there are very deep cultural aspects of it. This is not just about how much of GDP you put in there. You asked the question about 0.7%. Our industry sector has to be more respectful of creating knowledge, and they have to be big partners in this push for R&D. So while government, of course, has primary responsibility, especially for fundamental research and so on, is the industry that has to drive a whole lot of this agenda, converting knowledge into new opportunities. And that I think is beginning to happen, and certainly new policy would pay a lot of attention to that aspect. Well, how do we bring people to respect knowledge more, and because it works for them? It's not for the sake of knowledge, but to convince them that this is the only way for the future. Now, second aspect is okay, about the pandemic. So of course there are reports which say that pandemic in India is loosening up, is going down, and so on. But don't be fooled by that at all, because we know that in Europe there have been a second wave, third wave, and there is a third wave going on in Delhi right now as we speak. So what happens? Actually, what happens is that we just get a little bit comfortable. The familiarity breeds contempt, and we say we have been living with this virus for I don't know for very long, and so people get and the festivals are coming, winter is coming, maybe a little bit more pollution. So there are lots of unknowns out there, which could easily turn the tables. Absolutely. I mean, 100%, it can be much worse than what it was in the first week overall in India. So what do we do about it? What we do about it is, of course, continue to wear masking, distancing, ventilating, not crowding, disinfecting, all the protocols that by now we know by heart. So it's not about not knowing the protocols. It is about following them to the dot. We have come this far. We have come 8 months, right? And so if we stick to it for another 3 months, hopefully that there would be much better resolution of it. It would be at a level with which we can totally deal with it without impacting the economy very greatly, right? But it's all up to us. I mean, there's nothing written out there. There is no model, nothing that predicts, look, is going to go away. It's not going to go away. And if we can control it, we can keep it under control by religiously following all the things that we already know. And very, very critical, very important. We don't want to get into this, dangerous time again. So my appeal to everyone who listens to it is that don't relax. This is not the time to relax at all. On the contrary, this is the time to tighten up even more than before. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Maybe let me
Indeed, very,
to-
very, sir.
Let me just add, I think these are some very important points. I just wanted to complement this by, if you look at the previous pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, there are two key learnings that research, especially epidemiological research, from the Spanish flu, that needs to be highlighted. One, the Spanish flu actually lasted about 2 years, and that's one important aspect to remember. Second, the second wave of the Spanish flu was far more devastating than the first wave, and this is another key aspect that all of us must remember. And therefore following all the protocols actually is extremely critical. We have to remember, savdhani hati, durghatna gati.
Absolutely. On that note, we'll take you to the next question, sir. And this is for you, sir. From Mayank IIT Kharagpur, and he says that these are uncertain times, so the government is working on putting together the right response. What is the fiscal intervention required at such times, and what are the new schemes coming up, if you could tell us, in any sector? I think he's left it fairly open, the question.
So that's a good question. There are a couple of points that I want to make. Whenever you look at economic crisis, and in this case, of course, the economic crisis has been caused by the health crisis. Most of these economic crises, almost all, are one that actually stem from a paucity of demand. Every economic crisis eventually, down to its core, is something that actually is a manifestation of low demand. So the way to alleviate that crisis, and this is something that our kings and actually Nawabs used to do back, in our history as well. So some people would wonder, why would a king go and build a mahal when there is a famine? It will seem like he's actually indulging himself, when there is actually a famine. What was actually happening was, it was an opportunity to provide jobs. For instance, Lucknow's Imam Bara was actually built, following a famine, to give jobs to people. And that is essentially an illustration of fiscal policy. The fact that the government is the one that has the capacity to spend, and therefore it is really critical for the government to fill the gap when private sector, because of risk aversion, in such uncertain times, does not spend as much. So government needs to spend. That's number one. Second, actually, government also needs to fill the void of risk. So in order to create a risk multiplier and also an expectation multiplier. When the government, spends, what happens is that money reaches the private sector, and that enables the multiplication. As the economists always say, my spending is your income, and your spending is someone else's income, and that's how actually the multiplying effect happens in an economy. So this is a really critical aspect, that crises like these need the fiscal spending, and so that's point number one. Second, if you look at in terms of there are sometimes concerns that do we have the fiscal space to be able to do the spending? Here, the foreign savings that are coming in, for instance, the current account, in the first quarter, we had a surplus of $19.8 billion, about $20 billion. Now, even if we actually we don't have as good performance, but if we have, reasonable performance in the remaining 3 quarters, our current account may be in a surplus of about between 1.3, 1.4% to maybe 1.8%. Now, an emerging economy like ours should actually have a current account deficit, because what is the deficit? Basically, you are investing more than you're saving, and so that foreign savings are actually supporting your investment, which is what an emerging economy like ours needs to do. So the current account and the money that is coming in, I think, provides us the opportunity to really spend fiscally. Now, where should we be spending here? I think the most important should be on infrastructure, because infrastructure has this ability to really, create a multiplier effect. Infrastructure pushes construction activity, which creates a lot of jobs in the informal sector, and therefore has the bang for the buck is really very, very high. And in fact, if you go and look at the previous instance, for instance, after the Asian financial crisis, in 2000 to 2002, we had growth rates of 3.8% in 2000, 4.8% in 2001, and 3.8% in 2002. And what did the government then do? The Vajpayee government then did fiscal spending, built the golden quadrilateral. The debt to GDP rose to the historical high of 87%. But then that spending brought growth back to 8% plus for the next several years, and thereby, debt to GDP declined to 67%. So it is, there is that template for us to actually follow. It was reforms plus fiscal spending. Reforms have already been done. Now, it has to be on spending on infrastructure to enable, significant growth to be brought back.
Absolutely, and I hope, Mayank, your question has been answered, because as said, we need to take these measures in order to get that spike again. The next question, sir, is for you, Professor Ashutosh. How do you feel, and what are the steps taken by the Ministry of Science and Technology to grow scientific temper among the masses? This is from Rohit from IIT Kanpur.
Yeah, very, very interesting question, and I've often pondered over it. What I have pondered over is what exactly is the meaning of scientific temper. So if we don't know what we want to inculcate, then we don't know the right methods for doing it. So I would come to in a second about what do you do about inculcating scientific temper among the masses, right? So scientific temper, first of all, has no direct correlation with the formal education in science. So it could be either way. I mean, I've seen very good, great scientists, in fact, who may not, they may lose scientific temper as they come out of the lab or the office, right? So second
True.
aspect is scientific temper is all about people to think rationally, to think logically, to be based on evidence, and then solve problems, right? So it may be a disease, it may be something. So you're not thinking, look, somebody up there is going to help me, right? So you understand actually what the parameters of this problem are, and what would be the right way about going solving it. So it's not necessarily about science, but it is about some aspect of scientific methodology, if you would. Okay, so having said that, um, we certainly need a scientific temper at large, because we everybody's got problems at every scale, and how do you address these problems is very important. So by the way, there is also a strong idea of scientific temper. That is strong idea is that you remain rational and logical even in the face of when you have conflict with self-interest. Okay, so that is even a harder thing to satisfy, because we all know that I can be very rational and logical as long as it doesn't impact my self-interest, right? So that's the weaker principle, if you would, of of scientific temper, but not to lose that temper even in the face of adversity, which is personal. Okay, there is a strong statement of scientific temper. That gets a little bit more, I mean, the domain of moral and ethics and so on. So we now worry about that. But so what do we do? In fact, we started this OTT channel that Nidhi ji you have also been involved in. This OTT channel, which is now through Geo platform and other platforms, would be reaching crores of people. And you make a program every day, live programming for a couple of hours, as well as a huge library of all sorts of things. Like, okay, what is the meaning of this pandemic we are talking about? There are hundreds of videos literally in that. How does virus transmit? What do we need to do? Stuff. It's about climate change. It's about environment. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with the rise of intelligent machines? What is the future look like? How can we participate positively in shaping that future? So all of that is happening, and this has happened last couple of years. There are many programs that you do supported by DST on different channels and different radio programs. When you reach out to a lot of kids in school, it's always good to catch them young, because once you have stereotypes, conditioning, and so on, it's very hard to shake it off, right? If I always believe that my disease is because of whatever else, right, then it will be very difficult to change those ideas at a later date. So we reach out to a very large number of young people, students, rural areas, women, so we got a whole lot of this stuff. It doesn't matter if you stay home. Okay, maybe many women, in small towns and so on, but they are basically purveyors of culture. So when people, their children grow up, they listen to the mother, they listen to somebody, right? So all of this is very cultural, and so we, through many different programs, we reach out to very large number of young people, catch them young, farmers, women, everybody, and there's a huge number of programs. In fact, let me conclude by saying we don't have time actually to talk about details of the schemes and stuff. But I just point out, even the scientific temper, you see, even scientists can inculcate it much better. It's not only for masses. Okay, it is certainly for masses. But for example, a lot of people who do PhD, they're into very straight and narrow of their area. They don't necessarily connect with the larger concerns of science and society. They may not even know what they are doing, working so hard. How does it, really solve problems? So we started a new program called Avsar, in which we ask PhD students to write a story, a popular science story, based on their area of research that they understand very well, but bringing in the fact that this is basically should appeal to masses, be understandable by them, and that they gain something out of it. So how do it connect with the larger, world, the science that they are doing? And I'm so happy to report, last year we got what 5,000 stories from PhD students. So they really love to do it. And these top guys, 100 of them, they get good awards, rewards, and stuff get published. So all of this is happening from grassroots to our mature scientists, as well as, I mean, these are some of the agents through which we can also reach society at large, at every level, whether it is Children's Science Congress, whether it is Indian International Science Festival that we've been doing for last 5 years. Huge amount of participation there, and we need to do more of it. Basically, we need an army of people who totally understand what is what is scientific temper. I asked this question to many people, and I'm afraid I have to say that people have not understood the meaning of scientific temper. They think there is something related to doing MSc, right? It's certainly no correlation with that at all. It's not only for scientists; it is for everybody in life. And if we do that, we would really be a very prosperous, progressive nation. To
Yes, sir.
stop.
I
Maybe
think
let me add to. I think this is because of such an important concept of scientific temper. There are three key points that one has to remember with scientific temper. First, what is called Bayesian updating. Those that are in statistics understand what is called the Bayes theorem, which is you have some prior idea, prior belief. We all have that. It's sometimes actually it can be a stereotype. But when you're faced with evidence, when you actually see new evidence, if that evidence is strong, if it is something that is convincing, then that evidence should actually make you move your change your prior belief, and have a posterior belief. That's very important part of evidence and interpretation of evidence. If you actually are going to see evidence, and even if the evidence is compelling, you say nahi main nahi manta isko, then that is not consistent with scientific temper. That's point number one. The second point with scientific temper is actually, in my opinion, scientific temper is about deep thinking, is about rigor in thinking. And rigor in thinking, I say this as an engineer myself, is not about actually putting alpha, beta, gamma, or mathematics. That's not what rigor in thinking is about. Rigor in thinking is like peeling the layers of an onion. You ask the first why, and then you get an answer to that. That makes you ask a second why, and then the third why, and the fourth why, and so on. That is what rigor in thinking is about. It's in some sense like a grandmaster thinks his move and then says what the opponent's move would be, and then so on. How many levels are you able to think? That's what rigor in thinking is about. That's what scientific temper is. And final point, and this is something I say this from personal experience, that scientific temper and faith can coexist. I think this idea that scientific temper and faith are actually just mutually exclusive is not something that I say this from personal experience. Others may have a different view on it. For instance, and one of the ways I have lived is, you prepare for an examination as if everything is in your hands. But after the examination is over, you pray as if everything is in God's hands. That's the combination of basically science, of scientific temper and faith. It is not about basically saying, not preparing and going to the examination saying Bhagwan Malik hai. That's not what scientific temper or even faith is about. Faith also tells you that God helps those who help themselves.
absolutely. And this is India's worldview, sir, what you just said. Science and spirituality, they exist together in tandem. And I'd like to add one more little thing to what sir said. And you said Article 51AH of our Constitution is mandates the scientific temper, and we need to inculcate it in every school, in every university. And the way to do it, I think probably we could have more industry collaborations in school laboratories. That could be one of the things, but that's a different topic which would interest all of us, and maybe we could have around two of the same thing to take that further. The
Yeah,
next question.
easy. I think we should have a separate session. I would think on scientific temper and
Yes.
how do we go about doing it. I think it's fantastic. Let's do it sometime.
Because sir, rote learning, there's so much to it, sir. Okay. The next question, sir, for you again, Subramanian, sir. And this is a little critical because it is the question asked by most Indians today. How can we help create more jobs? That Philip that we need to provide. How are you as a CEA looking at this? And this question comes from Rajendra Babuta of NIIT Bangalore, sir.
Firstly, let me congratulate Rajendra for an excellent question. Something that all of us should be asking. I've alluded partly to to this when I mentioned about reforms, for instance, and I said that the reforms in are primarily directed towards the primary and secondary sector, agriculture, which is primary, and manufacturing, which is secondary. The reason this is important, and that is one of the key ideas that has been driving the reforms, is that if you look at the constitution of the workforce, a significant part of the workforce works in the primary and secondary sectors, and can in fact work, there can be a large proportion of the workforce that can be accommodated in both these sectors simultaneously. India, if you look at the last 30 years, has grown very well in the tertiary sector, which is the service sector. Now, that is something that actually does provide a lot of jobs. But what is also important, if we have to create jobs in large numbers for the large, the burgeoning youth that we have, the primary and the secondary sectors have to contribute, and it has to happen in two ways. One, productivity has to go up in the primary sector, agriculture, and that's where these reforms, the farm reforms that are I think will play a critical part. But at the same time, the reforms in the manufacturing, your labor reforms, the MSME definitional changes, the export PLI scheme, the entire Make in India campaign, all these together will actually produce more jobs in manufacturing, because labor, the way the labor laws were a big inhibitor for job creation in the economy, because if the employer could not cater his employment to the market conditions, that made him very, very reluctant to hire, and that therefore really affected the prospect for increasing employment. Now, with these reforms, that is really enabled. So when you have more people coming into manufacturing, agriculture, the number of people working in agriculture can be reduced, and thereby the farms that are used, the size of the farms, economies of scale can be better generated, and thereby that will also add to the productivity improvements in agriculture, which is something already will happen through these reforms. And one of the key things is that salaries and wages actually are related eventually to the productivity of the job. So as productivity goes up, salaries and wages will go up as well. So well-paying jobs will be created in agriculture and manufacturing. And that is one of the key ways in which we're actually pushing. Second, related to that, is actually something that we spoke about earlier, which is about investment. Investment, is something that actually brings jobs. Many of us think that capital and labor are substitutable. For instance, we may think that the coming of teller machines, ATM machines, for instance, automatic teller machines, maybe took away the job of the cashier. That is something if you look just at the surface, then you think about it. But now, if you count all the jobs that are created in manufacturing ATM machines, administering those ATM machines, then there are a lot of jobs that have been created as well. So when you have investment, the nature of jobs changes. But it is not right to say that investment actually robs jobs. When you look at it by taking the entire supply chain into account, investment in turn actually brings jobs, and that is something that is. So the emphasis is on the primary and secondary sectors and in enabling investment, both of which will really help in creating well-paying jobs, or jobs in the organized sector, going forward. Because finally, if you think about economic inclusion and social inclusion, there is nothing better than one member in a family getting a job in the organized sector. That really brings both social and economic inclusion.
Absolutely, sir. And totally agree with you. So the next question we have is for you, Ashutosh, sir. And this relates to involving industry in creation of relevant knowledge economy kind of thing. How could we find solutions to the development of more digital technology? And as our topic today is COVID-19, do you think those kind of apps have been made? Please elaborate on that. How has all this mushroomed in India?
Yeah, so thinking about digital technologies, in fact, what Subramanian said just now about ATM machine, they also another aspect to it. I do recall in my good old days, you get into a bank line, you stay there for 1 hour, you listen to all the nonsense that people were talking. But now you say that 1 hour, and then you are so much more healthy in your brain, so your productivity actually has gone up. So not only that you have created new jobs because in other sectors, but also all these people who are suffering the tyranny of bank, right? They have been now freed. I mean, their energy and time has been so greatly freed, and that's what machines do. Okay, so of course, every technology has a light and a shadow. So there are shadows of technology that we must understand for each technology, and we must know how to address those shadows while increasing the brightness of the light of that technology. Now, your question was about digital technologies, and that indeed is relevant in this context because a lot of people say, of course, it's going to happen that if there's Industry 4.0, if there are thinking machines, if there is artificial intelligence, you would need a new jobs, you would for which you would need new skills, and you would need new education if you would. In fact, the education of future should be all only about the capacity to learn continuously. It is not about the content of what is actually being taught. It's very little about the content. I mean, you can learn it on your own when you need it, and some new stuff is coming in, you need it, you learn it continuously and apply it. So, digital technologies certainly are here to stay, and they are going to grow exponentially. To give you an example, we started a mission last year on cyber physical systems, and that pretty much covers, it's pretty good, it's about 4,000 crores. So, it's generating capacity, capability, human resources at every level, and also from R&D all the way to industry and translation and so on. So, it's fantastic. Now, now the way actually that this would work, that I'm talking about creating new digital technologies. I'm not talking about the use of technologies right now, which is a separate issue. Creating digital technology or new technologies, it has to happen in close collaboration with people who generate knowledge and also people who can use that knowledge. Now, our weakness actually is not so much in the creation of knowledge, but in the direction of that knowledge and its eventual consumption of that knowledge. So these things, these links are created, for example, in this mission from the beginning. This is to say, do create profound knowledge, not just be a follower or this great university XYZ somewhere because it's fashionable there. We must know what our problems are. We must also know what kind of exciting knowledge we need to create in that domain, and also link it with people who be able to use it. Of course, lots of apps are coming up. For example, this Setu, right, for
Mm,
pandemic. Now,
mm,
all of this actually, the Setu would be as effective as the number of people who would be using it. So when we talked about things we need to do in the pandemic, one of the things is of course tracing. Who do you want to? Is there somebody around you that you need to avoid? If you have come in contact with somebody, you should know, right? So this contact tracing, tracking, isolating, quarantining is another aspect of containing the pandemic and its spread. And this is all possible through digital means. But it's also a question of how widespread is the acceptance of these measures of digital technologies. So, so I think it's happening, and there's no doubt that this is all of the future of humanity. It throws up many questions. Not everything is clear at this point as to what shapes the digital technologies would eventually take. I have a view regarding this. In 20 years from now, the going into industry 650 or something like that. Basically, you would integrate biology and life with digital. So while digital today remains in something passive, something in my hand is getting more widespread, it's getting into my life, but it's not getting into my body yet. Okay, so that's going to happen, that integration, that last frontier of knowledge, if you would, right? So digital is not simply digital out there, that digital becomes all pervasive, and there are grave dangers as well. So point is, and we don't have time to discuss this should be another session on saying, look, how digital cyber and its integration into our life is going to impact every aspect of our life, whether it is
yes.
about dating people, whether it's about my marrying people, whether it is about the shape of the governance, it is about the shape of the democracy in which we live. Every single aspect, right? It's so fascinating. There are challenges and opportunities out there. Every challenge should translate into at least two new opportunities. And that is all about being digital, right? So I stopped there because of lack of time, we would run out of it very soon.
Absolutely.
Maybe
And as you spoke of, sir. Please.
let me just add to, on the digital economy. The digital economy survives on data. Data is the oil for the digital economy. And here I want to highlight that in the July 2019 economic survey, we had written a chapter which was titled Data of the People, by the People, for the People. Which is viewing data as a public good, much like we think about roads, highways, ports, airports as infrastructure. I think for industry 4.0, for enabling the digital economy, we have to think about the information highway, and data in that as actually as a key infrastructure element as well, and invest in creating that infrastructure. For instance, governments have survey data, they have administrative data through various welfare programs, and there's third party data as well. By bringing together all these data sets, by providing a good 360-degree view while maintaining privacy of the individual, but by aggregating and anonymizing these data sets, and creating data sets at scale, and also having a large time series, that's how the digital economy can be enabled. So I think the data quality and data is necessary for the digital economy. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary, and therefore that necessary precondition has to be invested in for us to really enable industry 4.0.
Absolutely. And build resilient
I think this
infrastructure.
is so fascinating, so fascinating. I can't contain myself. I so agree with what was said. In fact, people say data is the new oil, and I always correct them. I said data is the new water. Actually, oil is not that indispensable. And going forward in the future, oil is going to disappear, but water is going to be there forever, and is going to be so valuable. Now, India is very data rich, and data is the stuff on which rides all information, all knowledge, all uses, and so on. So, data is very rich in data, India, but unfortunately, historically, we have never valued our raw material, and data is a raw material based on which everything happens. So, I just hope that we do not repeat that mistake again. Data, I hear a lot of people say, "Hey, is my algorithm? Give me the data." Algorithms are dime a dozen. To generate right kind of data is far more difficult. It takes more resources, in fact, than to produce an algorithm. So don't let some salesman come and sell you plastic for your diamonds. Okay, that is my very short appeal. Understand, respect data, and hold on to it. I mean, unless you get the right barter for it.
Absolutely. Sir, on that note, I'd like to request you, Ashutosh sir, and I'd like to tell the viewers firstly that both of you, being from IIT Kanpur, also share a very lovely relationship, that being of a teacher and a student. Sir, Ashutosh sir, may I ask you to ask your very, very eminent, very bright student, one who stands very tall in India today, a question, please?
Not just in India, I would say globally. I think we should have global aspirations now, and I think it's
One of
fantastic.
the brightest
So,
minds,
so
yes.
here's a very quick quiz, and I always been thinking about it. I ask every economist that I know, and here is a very distinguished one. So I say, look, with the rise of sustainable development concerns, with the rise related climate change, environment, constraints on our resources, which have never been, in the you're living in 1960s world, nobody thought about these things. They said technology was forever, that our improvement in life is forever, that this party will continue forever, right? Those were the optimism of the days which are gone now. So now, what I'm saying is, are there any economic models that are alternate to what we now do and how we do it, right? To attain, development, sustainable development, happiness, nirvana, whatever you call it, or would this model can continue forever and not lead to disasters? So, what are the alternatives?
I think, Professor Sharma, this is an excellent question. I think the Indian model of economic development is in my opinion the answer to this. Allow me to expand on this concept. First thing, a lot of us, especially economists, typically think that economic thinking is only what started with Adam Smith. But an important fact to remember, and this has been documented by Angus Madison, who looked at the GDP and the contribution to world's GDP of various countries. One fact that stands out, from that is that India, for 3/4 of known economic history, which is the last 2 millennia, up until 1750 AD, contributed more than 1/3 of the world's GDP. Now, that's 17.5 centuries, India contributed more than 1/3 of world's GDP. Just to give you a sense of the dominance here, all of us have been following the US elections because US is an economic superpower. Now, US's contribution at its peak to world GDP has been of the order of 15-16%, and that too for half a century. So just put these two together, 17.5 centuries and contributing more than 33% of world's GDP versus half a century with about 15-16%. That gives you an idea of the dominance. Now, Professor Sharma, you would acknowledge that such kind of dominance never ever happens by accident. Such kind of dominance only quality of thinking, the model that was based on this thinking, and that model was of ethical wealth creation. Ethical wealth creation, which combined the private enterprise. So what we call in the economic survey the invisible hand of the market. This is something that Adam Smith coined, together with the hand of trust. It's a marriage of the hand of trust with the invisible hand of markets. And this hand of trust is extremely important in the context of the question that you've asked, which is that, and it's about ethical wealth creation, not just wealth creation through any means. And, if you think about it, actually, in our homes, we capture this in so many, so it's such a simple way. We, write Shubh Labh. Shubh and Labh are together, which means Shubh is something that is salutary, good, and then Labh is profit. So, it's basically advocacy here is of generating profits by doing something good, not we never write Ashubh and Labh. That's not what we talk about. So profit generation has to come by not harming the environment, by not harming others. And this is in fact advocated in as disparate literature as the Arthashastra written in Sanskrit, which a lot of people in the north are familiar with. Also, the Tirukkural, something that the Honorable Prime Minister remarked in his recent Man Ki Baat, written in Tamil by Saint Tiruvalluvar. Now, you go and read as disparate literature as these, they both talk about ethical wealth creation. And that is what led to that kind of dominance. So we really need to be returning back to that, private sector and the government needs to return back to ethical wealth creation. And that ethical part itself actually drew, its vitality from the very deep spiritual and cultural traditions that we had. And that is what I think we really need to be able to generate sustainable growth, sustainable economic development, not just wealth creation, but ethical wealth creation. Because mein sab samaj aata hai. Actually, you think about even climate change, or even once you take a loan, you repay it. That not default willfully. That cannot be ethical wealth creation. All these aspects. Similarly, if there is a particular product that you are selling to the customer, if you say it is basically this, it has these qualities, then it should have those qualities. That is what ethical wealth creation is about. Not that you promise one product and deliver something else. That is not ethical wealth creation. These are all various aspects that are indeed captured in this idea. So what we really need is a return back to that model, away from the model of either wealth creation by any means, or even socialism, which is basically something where wealth was treated as a necessary evil, which is not consistent with our thinking. Because if you think about the various noble pursuits, the four noble pursuits, dharma, arth, kama, moksha, in that earth is actually mentioned as a noble pursuit. And as you would acknowledge, then a noble pursuit cannot actually happen in ashubh ways. It has to be done in shubh, and that is why ethical wealth creation. That is what we really need by marrying the invisible hand of market, private enterprise with the hand of trust.
Absolutely. And as you said very rightly,
This is so fantastic, Nidhi ji, and because this is something that needs to be discussed. This is really the fundamental question, I would think, for all humans who live on this planet now and a century from now as well. So, what one has to think about is true that this is about ethical wealth creation and development and so on. But who is in control? Who is going to do it? Right? I mean, so next question would be, we can discuss it later, because when you look at from the level of an individual to the level of a nation and indeed the entire globe, we are all sold to this idea that just do consumption, right? Okay, you buy 5 cars. If you don't need them, doesn't really matter, right? And to hell with who's going to live after me, right? So there's a very deeply cultural aspect, and you have to inject some spirit into it, into this material. So then the question is, who's going to do it? Because who is in control, right? This is all autopilot, right? Anyway, so I think I stop there. It's been such a fantastic session, so much learning. So I should thank Dr. Subramanian for being with us, and Nidhi ji, please you go ahead thanking him as well.
So wonderful. On that very pragmatic note, as you mentioned, sir, ethical trade-offs is a strict no-no, and that is what we're having everywhere, including the US elections. With that, we come to an end of the question answer round. Thank you very much for joining us. I thank Professor Ashutosh Sharma, Secretary DST, and our esteemed keynote speaker for today, Shri Krishnamurthy Subramanian, CEA to GOI, for sharing his vision on the other side of the pandemic. It was indeed a very insightful lecture, as Professor Ashutosh has also been his teacher at the IIT Kanpur. We request you to join us on more occasions, sir. We have lots and lots of questions on MSMEs to sustainable cities just pouring in. I can see them here, but we need to close now. I thank the audience for watching. The present COVID-19, friends, has been a very big challenge, and not just on the health, emotional, economic front, but in a bigger way as well. People all over the world are working hard to reconstruct their lives while facing COVID-19 challenges. Facing such a global crisis, one might imagine that it would be very difficult to rise from the ashes. However, let us remember that God has made this world full of opportunities. There is no room for despair. I'm sure India will rise like the phoenix. And on that note, it's a wrap on this edition of DST Golden Jubilee Series #5. And as we firmly sign off and bring the program to an end, I request you to please stand for the national anthem. Namaste.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे